You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about exciting, creative, and innovative ways of living. Produced in Santa Barbara, California, Sustainable World focuses on positive solutions to environmental challenges, solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics, earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe, how to plant a food forest, restorative design, or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned to Sustainable World Radio. I'm Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Dave Jacke, author of Edible Forest Gardens. It's an award-winning 2-volume book set. Dave is also a longtime permaculture teacher and designer. So Dave, if you could give our listeners your definition of what an edible forest garden is.
An edible forest garden is a garden that you design to mimic the structure and function of forest ecosystems, but grow food, fuel, fiber, fodder, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, and fun.
That's a lot. I think that's your 7 Fs that you refer to.
That's the 7 Fs, yeah.
And we're going to learn more about that in a few minutes. And, you know, I love your book. I think it's wonderful. I haven't read both of them yet. I've been working on volume 1. I think it's amazing. You write about gardening like a forest. Mm-hmm. And when I read that, it just really, I love that phrase. How does one garden like a forest?
Well, the idea is that we're gardening like the forest, not necessarily gardening in the forest. So you don't have to have a forest in order to forest garden, although you certainly can if you have a forest. In fact, I actually prefer people to take lawn and convert it back into something more like this. The idea is to look at how forest ecosystems operate and take the principles and the patterns and the processes as models so that we can gain the properties of forests in our gardens. Those properties are things like stability, resilience, self-maintenance, which is the holy grail. I mean, you know, in the Arthurian legends, only one knight actually discovered the holy grail, and when he did, he died. So if you actually achieve self-maintenance in your forest garden, you'll be in heaven. Anyway, so self-maintenance, self-renewing fertility, the production of clean air and clean water, increasing soil fertility and biodiversity and water holding capacity over time. All these things are things that forest ecosystems, in fact, most perennial systems composed of perennial plants will do all those things as they mature. And so we're looking to those ecosystems, and I focus on forests because that's the kind of habitat I live in, as our models, and trying to understand how they achieve those properties so that we can mimic that. And the reason we're mimicking it rather than imitating it, which would be, you know, to create a forest and it looks like a forest, is because we don't necessarily want to have a forest. A forest is a very dense stand of trees that have 100% canopy cover and interlocking crowns. And that's the crowns being interlocking, it's like jigsaw puzzle pieces. That means that they're under a lot of competition and stress. And that's not necessarily what we want. We want something that's a little more open, a little more sunlight down to the ground level, most likely. I mean, everyone's going to have different goals. But in most cases, we're looking at actually something that's more of a mid-succession habitat, somewhere halfway between succession is this process where if you have bare soil and you let it go, in most parts of the world, it'll convert into something else over time. You know, whether in this part of California, it might convert to chaparral, but in my part of the country, it'll convert into forest over time. So that process of ecosystem change from one plant community to another, to another, to another, eventually ending up as forest, that's called succession. So mid-succession is kind of halfway along that transformational line, and it's anything between an old field mosaic, which is a mix of perennial grasses, perennial herbs, shrubs, and pioneer trees, sun-loving trees. Anything like that up to more of an open woodland with shrubs and herbaceous stuff as well. So you might have widely spaced trees or whatever. So somewhere in there is actually going to have higher productivity than a mature forest will. And also that stage of succession is also what most of the crops that we already have that are perennials, peaches, apples, pears, plums, persimmons, raspberries, blueberries, they're all mid-succession species. So by going for mid-succession, we're actually going to be designing a habitat that's adapted to the species that we already have that we like to eat. And as a system, as an ecosystem, it's been shown that mid-succession forests are actually more productive. More sunlight gets converted to biomass every year in those than in mature forests. So there's a lot of reasons to actually, we should probably be calling it woodland gardening, but it doesn't sound quite as nice, and it's not, it's not what Robert Hart first called it, and that's what it's known as is forest gardening. So we're gardening like the forest, not in the forest necessarily.
And what struck me, too, when I was looking through your book and reading your book is that it seems like we're really expending, Americans especially maybe, keeping our lawns and gardens in early succession, which made total sense to me. Could you tell us a bit about that and kind of the futility of that, or the time and energy and money that you're spending doing that?
Yeah, well, in order to maintain a lawn or to create the habitat that's good for annual vegetables, you have to disturb the soil or cause some sort of disturbance to the ecosystem. Now, a disturbance is actually a scientific term that denotes a discrete event in time and space that changes the structure or composition of the plant community. So mowing would be a disturbance. Tilling the soil is a disturbance. In a forest, if you have a blowdown or a tree dies and falls over, or you have an insect attack or a fire, those are all disturbances. There's many different kinds of disturbance. And ecosystems have adapted to most ecosystems have a regime of disturbance. That the disturbance comes over, certain kinds of disturbances come at a certain frequency. And the plants that live in those habitats have evolved to be adapted to those disturbances. And annual plants they have a strategy that J.P. Grime calls the ruderal strategy. Ruderal, the word ruderal means rubble in Latin. They're plants that grow on the rubble of disturbance. And what they do is they are adapted to absorb highly water-soluble nutrients out of the soil to grow in 1 or sometimes 2 years. Biennials or annuals or biennials here are ruderals, and to make as many seeds as possible that will live for a long period, stay dormant for a long period in the soil. And from the perspective of the plants themselves, they are just trying to make a living. Their main strategy is to make as many babies as possible in hopes that some of them will live again. From the ecosystem's perspective, what they're doing is when there's a disturbance, it breaks open all the nutrient conservation cycles that have built up into a system, and nutrients become water-soluble, and they can leach away and be lost forever to the ecosystem. So the ruderals are there from the community's perspective to catch those nutrients and hold them and get them back into organic matter before they leach away. But because we're using annuals all the time in our agriculture, we're destroying the nutrient conserving system, and the nutrients all leach away, which is why, back in the 1800s, the prairies of North America had 6 to 7 feet of topsoil, and now they're like 6 inches. It's all washing down. It's all being destroyed by the way we do agriculture, growing annuals. And the soil has gotten to a point where it's dead enough that the soil is mainly a rooting medium to help the plants stay upright, and then we apply water-soluble fertilizers to keep the plants alive. And the process of tilling, the weeding, and the fertilizers and the insecticides add up to a point where in North America we're spending 10 calories of energy to get every calorie of food that we eat. And 9 of those calories are coming from fossil fuels. And when we're buying fossil fuels, we're making climate change happen. We're funding the terrorists through Saudi Arabia. And these are not things that we really want to be doing. So, forest gardening using perennials, using trees, is a way to reduce that energetic cost. And we don't really know how much yield we can get in these systems in temperate climates because no one's been doing it in temperate climates for a long time. The Native Americans used to do this kind of agriculture, but the Europeans couldn't even see it as agriculture because it looked like a forest to them. So we don't really know what kind of yields we can get, but we do know that you can do it with less energy, and if you can have a much lower energy footprint and still get a decent enough yield, it's a benefit. So yeah, and then lawn is just there's so much lawn. 12% of the I think it was 1990, 12% of the continental United States was covered in lawn, and I'm sure it's more now. And the amount of energy going into that, and that's just most of that lawn. So some amount of lawn is good. It's fine. You got to have a place to play, kick a ball around with your kids, whatever. But so much of it is about status and exemplifying our culture's need for control, and it's all this emotional baggage that we're projecting on the landscape, and we just don't need the lawn as much as we have.
There's a food forest in town, Linda and Larry Bazell, and they started out with a giant lawn, and when you go to their house now, the whole backyard is a food forest, and the front yard has about maybe a 3-foot by 4-foot piece of lawn, if that big. And they said, this is our little token lawn we left here.
Yeah, it's, not quite big. You could curl up and lie down there. That's a good size. You might want to have a big enough patch of lawn that you can stretch out in the sun once in a while.
His feet are in a bush while he's laying there. So, Dave, if you could tell our listeners how would we be able to tell the difference between an orchard, growing maybe a monocrop of peaches or plums, and a thriving forest garden?
Well, there'd be a lot of differences. First of all, architecturally, in terms of the physical structure, an orchard, it basically has 2 layers of vegetation. You've got the trees and you've got the grass, or if you're lucky, you've got grass. Actually, they often in orchards will spray and kill the grass directly under the trees to reduce competition, etc. But in a forest garden, basically you have to have at least 3 layers of vegetation. It could be a ground layer, an herb layer, a shrub layer, a low tree layer, a tall tree layer, a vine layer. Any combination of the 3 of those. And generally, you're not going to have much monoculture or any monoculture in a forest garden. But of course, if you're going for a larger scale, it has to be a simpler system than it could be in your backyard. I mean, I know forest gardens that are 50 feet by 90 feet that have over 200 species in them. Okay, so that's a huge difference from an orchard. But the other factor is that. And this is a little bit harder to observe, but I mentioned earlier these properties of stability, resilience, self-maintenance, self-fertilization, self-renewal, and so on. Those are properties of ecosystems that emerge. They're called emergent properties. These properties emerge only from the dynamics between the elements in the system. They do not emerge from any element in itself. So the ability to create self-renewing fertility, to conserve nutrients, no one plant can do that by itself. No one species. You have to have a bunch of species acting in concert for that to happen. And orchards don't do that very well. They're not designed as an ecosystem. They are an ecosystem, because everything is an ecosystem. The inside of your car is an ecosystem. There's blue-green algae photosynthesizing under your on the dashboard below the glass, and there's fungi eating the crumbs on the floor, and stuff like that. So there's a food web inside your automobile, and everything's an ecosystem.
Yeah, my old roommate had grass growing out of his leaking Subaru one year.
Right, exactly. So, the idea here is that we're always designing ecosystems all the time, so why not get good at it? And a big piece of getting good at it is understanding that ecosystems have these emergent properties and learning how to design the ecosystem so that those emergent properties emerge. And some of those things are hard to actually observe. How do you know you've got self-renewing fertility? I mean, well, your plants will be healthy when you're not adding fertilizer every year. That's probably a long-term proposition, but it's something to strive for. Stability, resilience. I mean, perennial crops tend to have those qualities more anyway. But as a system, self-maintenance is more challenging too, because we know so little about ecosystem design. We're barely in the infancy. Forest gardening as a science or an art is really just being reborn in Western culture, and we have so much to learn. But we have 100+ years of ecology that we can use to draw on, and as well as looking at what the Native Americans are doing, looking at tropical systems, because forest gardening has been happening in the tropics for many, many, many years, thousands of years, and learning from all those different examples. On the note of the Native Americans, there's a book that I very highly recommend to everybody. Actually, two books. The first one is 1491 by Charles Mann, and basically that book looks at the last 30 years or so of work in historical ecology and ecological archaeology and stuff, looking at North and South America. And the basic thesis that arises from the work that he summarizes in that book is that the vast majority of North and South America were largely managed landscapes for up to 40,000 years. All right, contrary to everything we learn in school. Today's Columbus Day. You're interviewing me on Columbus Day, also known as Indigenous Peoples Day. And, people think that, first of all, that Columbus discovered America, which is ridiculous.
I just read a shirt that the Native Americans discovered Columbus lost.
Yeah, right, exactly. And second of all, that the native peoples, the people who are living on these continents, were passive consumers of the gifts that the ecosystem offered. And they were actually sophisticated ecosystem managers. And the second book explains a lot more about how that was done. It's called Tending the Wild by M. Cat, with a K, Anderson from University of California. And she spent 15 or 20 years interviewing native elders to find out what their grandparents were doing, and documents, in a number of different ways, the land management practices, and shows that the way they managed landscapes actually improved the health of the species they managed and harvested and the landscape as a whole. And it's all about California. And California is an extremely diverse, very complex set of ecosystems and cultures were here. And she documents cultures all over the state and how that was true for those cultures. And if it was true for them, it was probably true all over this continent and South America. And there's not much evidence from the East where I live. I live in Massachusetts, because they were wiped out within a decade or two of initial contact from diseases that they had no genetic experience with. There was a 90 to 95% die-off right after initial European contact, and that changed the landscape dramatically because they stopped managing it. There were only a few people left, and they were in scattered bands. They were disorganized. They weren't a society anymore because of this mass die-off. So, the whole scene is. Cat Anderson's book is the best evidence we have for specific practices that demonstrate what the Native Americans were doing, and it's a bummer that it's only for California. But those of you who live out here have the boon of that, and that's good because you got some challenging landscapes to manage out here. So an orchard just isn't going to have those qualities, and those emergent properties are really what we're after. They're our design goals. And we have to learn how to design systems that cause those emergent properties to arise. That's what we have to learn how to do.
Which really seems like it adds on that whole other layer of observation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's observation and careful interpretation, which is, this is one of the things I teach a lot, is the difference between observation and interpretation. And it's an incredible inner practice. I won't call it spiritual per se, but the mental discipline of distinguishing between observations and interpretations comes in quite handy in so many realms of life. And ecological design helps us learn to do that, because we have to learn to not jump to conclusions. It's hard to actually come to conclusions, because there's so little we know. But to say, okay, here's a thesis, here's a thought, here's a theory, here's another theory, and to explore and play. And as primates, we learn best when we play. So I encourage people to play, and I encourage people to make as many mistakes as possible, because we need to make a lot of mistakes so we can learn all these new things and innovate. And an ecological design process is all about making as many mistakes as fast as possible, ideally on paper, so you can make some new and interesting and different mistakes you can really learn something from on the ground.
I love that. Now, if someone was listening and thought, well, where is there a place I can go to see an example of a forest garden? Are there any places around the world where someone could observe that?
Oh, there's many. There's my co-author Eric Tonesmeyer and I traveled to Britain and all over the U.S. looking at examples that we could find in the late 90s when we started writing the books. And we saw a lot of people making the same mistakes, and people not really grasping all the tools they need in the design process to design a good forest garden. I know a lot of people are putting forest gardens in. Our books came out in 2005, so they've been out for 6 years now. And I get emails, hey, I put a forest garden in, but they don't send pictures, But we have started, there's a wiki website called the apiosinstitute.org, APIOS, apiosinstitute.org, where you can post information about your forest garden. There's forest garden pages. There's species pages, so you can post your experience with different species. And there's polyculture pages where you can say, here's a polyculture I've tried, these 3 or 4 species that I've tried mixing together, and here's what's happening with it. And other people can read your experience and try it themselves and then report on their experience, so we can all start learning from each other. So that website is still under development, but I may be jumping the gun putting it out so soon, but I think you'll still find it useful, and to really get full access, you got to pay $25 a year. But I think it's going to help people a lot to design better forest gardens and learn from each other. So I'm sure there's people. I mean, you mentioned these folks here in Santa Barbara who have a forest garden of some sort, and I didn't even know of them until you mentioned it. There's folks in Los Angeles where I just taught over the weekend who are doing stuff, and I know there's folks up in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California and the Midwest and Asheville, North Carolina area, and I just taught a 9-day forest garden design intensive at the farm in Summertown, Tennessee, Stephen Gaskin territory, and so there's stuff under development there, and the Northeast, and my garden is not much to look at because I'm on the road so much. Mostly what I'm observing in my garden is who outcompetes whom, and what does drought do when you're not there to water it. But I'm learning some stuff from it, so it's not much to look at. But my co-author Eric and his gardening partner Jonathan in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and they have a really great example. They've been tending it quite assiduously for the past 6 or 7 years, and it's really a nice garden. So it's a great place to go look.
Okay, so Dave, if you could tell our listeners about the 7 F's that you were talking about earlier, and what people can hope to gain from these wonderful gardens.
Well, one of the things we're looking for in a forest garden is a lot of yields, and you're going to get the most yields if you don't look for just one kind of yield. So I said food, fuel, fiber, fodder, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, and fun. So food is, edible forest gardens. That's the focus of the books. But fuel, fiber, fodder for animals, food for animals, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, meaning medicinal herbs, and fun. It's a lot of fun to do all this. So, I'm working on a new book with my friend Mark Kravchuk on coppice agroforestry. Coppicing is what happens when you cut a tree or shrub and it resprouts from the stump. The material that regrows is called coppice. The act of cutting for that purpose is called coppicing. And it was the foundation of the medieval European economy way back in the Middle Ages. They were made just a huge number of different products out of that, including fuel, firewood, small diameter firewood. They were not harvesting. They didn't have the energy or the equipment to move huge logs around and mow them into, saw them into boards. So they were using small diameter wood coming off of coppice stumps that were cut again and again and again. Data has shown that when you coppice a tree, it can live for 1,000 to 2,000 years, right, rather than 250 or 350 years, which is a huge difference and much more sustainable. And you always have roots holding soil in the ground, right? So fuel is a big piece of that. Fiber of all kinds for making tool handles and furniture and buildings, and it goes on and on and on. There are a number of things you can do with it. Some people are using coppicing material for mulch. So, for example, willow is a magnesium accumulator, and Robert Hart had a 20 by 40 foot stand of willows that he was coppicing and using as mulch in his garden every year, and he's basically adding magnesium to his garden by doing that. Nitrogen fixing plants like black locust, a lot of your white thorn, I guess they're called California wild lilacs around here. There's a bunch of different ceanothus species. Those are all nitrogen fixers. You can cut those and they'll resprout. Not all of them. There's some of the species will resprout, some of them won't. But there's a lot of different plants you can use in that way. You don't even have to chip them. It's called chop and drop. You could plant a nut tree and plant a bunch of nitrogen-fixing shrubs around that nut tree, and then just whack the nitrogen-fixing shrubs back, drop the branches in the ground. Those branches will add nitrogen to the soil, but also when you chop the tree, the shrub, the roots will die back, and those will add nitrogen also to feed the nut tree. And that's a way to fertilize without having to buy fertilizer. That's fertilizer and fiber and food and fuel. Fodder for animals also with coppice. White mulberry is a species. Morus alba is the Latin name, and it has been shown. They've been testing it in the tropics, and they're getting 8,000 to 10,000 pounds per acre of leaf material that is higher in nitrogen, higher in protein than alfalfa. And they can take dairy cows and feed them 75% white mulberry leaves and 25% protein concentrate, and only have a 3% drop in milk production. And the cost of production is way lower because you're not buying grain from the Midwest. All right, so there's and humans can also eat white mulberry leaves. Actually, they're pretty good tasting. So there's a lot of crops like that we can play with for fodder. For all different kinds of animals. And then pharmaceuticals, people know about ginseng and golden seal. A lot of people do. And those are woodland herbs. You can grow this in fairly deep shade. Maybe not here in California, it's too dry, but in my part of the country they were common until the Europeans wiped them out. But we can actually bring those species back and conserve them and protect them by actually growing them. So it's the fun of it is that it's really fascinating. It's an education, and we learn something about ourselves in this process. I mentioned the observation interpretation piece, but the whole ecological design process is really helping us understand who we are and what is our place in the ecosystem. So it's a lot of fun, and it's challenging, and there's a lot to learn, and we have lifetimes of quiet adventure ahead of us that we can enjoy. So.
Love it. And that brings me to one of my questions about what we were talking about earlier is really where is our place, or what is our place in a landscape that's allowed succession, that's kind of allowed to proceed along its way?
Rather than mowing and dominating and controlling, what's our role if we're not in control?
Yeah, what would we do?
I don't know. Oh, man, what a conundrum. In all the experience that I've had as an ecological designer and teaching forest gardening and doing forest gardening and pondering this question of who are we, it turns out that there's this quote from Masanobu Fukuoka, who wrote The One Straw Revolution, and I think it's the most important sentence from the whole book. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. The way we garden or farm, it reflects the way we see the world. And if we see the world as a collection of independent, isolated elements that don't interact with each other, we're never going to understand how nature works. So for me, forest gardening is really about, yes, producing food and all our other needs, and regenerating the planet at the same time. But it's also primarily or deeply about us getting a different sense of who we are and changing our paradigms, cultivating and perfecting new ways of seeing, thinking, being, and acting as human beings. And what is that? Well, Penny Livingston Stark is a permaculture designer from Northern California, and she apparently, according to Starhawk, she in her book The Earth Path, she wrote about this, and she says that Penny, heard Bill Mollison, one of the co-founders of permaculture, say that permaculture is about working with nature, not against her, which sounds great, but Penny realized that statement of Mollison's is still coming from the paradigm that humans and nature are separate. We're working with nature, but she's standing over there. And she thought to herself, so the story goes, that what would it sound like to say the same thing from the paradigm that humans and nature are one system? We are nature working. We're not working with nature. We are nature working or playing or, singing a song. We are nature. And that shift from perspective is huge. If we are nature, then nuclear plants are natural. Cars and highways, they're all nature. And when we start realizing that that's true, then it changes everything about how we interact with the world. So what that leads me to is to an understanding that human beings are what scientists call a keystone species. All right. So a keystone species is a species whose population and behavior affects every other species in its ecosystem. So in the Pacific Northwest, it would be salmon. Without the salmon bringing nutrients from the ocean back up into the land would be much lower in nutrients throughout the whole watershed, because the bears and other animals eat those salmon. They poop those nutrients back out into the environment, and that enriches the whole ecosystem, and all the species benefit. In the Everglades, they go through a dry period in the summertime, and the alligators make alligator holes, and that gives them a place to stay underwater so they don't dry up in the summertime. But it also provides a disturbance which keeps succession going, and it makes these wet spots that other animals come to so they can stay watered during the summertime, which also provides an easy meal for the alligators because they all have to go there, and they just pick a few off here and there. They don't need to eat everybody. And then you have this whole successional process that goes on. You've got drier sites and wetter sites. It just diversifies the whole ecosystem of the Everglades. Well, human beings are the keystone species of the whole planet right now. Our population and our behavior affects everything. And right now, it's not affecting it very well. But if we shrink from that role, if we try to minimize our negative impact, that's not going to be enough. And we have to change our orientation. We actually need to have a bigger footprint, in my opinion. All right? Let's turn this around. Let's turn this on its head. If we're a keystone, our role is to have a huge positive impact, to regenerate the planet, to heal the planet. That is our role. We are ecosystem managers. We're guiders of change. And when we understand that, and we do that to be of service to everything, to everyone, that is a whole different ballgame. And it's fulfilling. It's exciting. It's challenging. It's hard. It's fun. That is what I'm here to do. That is what I think all of us are here to do. And that is what a forest garden is here to teach us how to do, in my opinion.
That was great. So, Dave, if someone listening to this wanted to find out more, wanted to get your book, what's the best way for them to get your book to help support you? And then are you available for speaking engagements, lectures, workshops?
Oh, yeah. I live on the road a lot, traveling and teaching. I decided when my books came out in 2005, I decided that partly given how much debt I was in from writing them for 8 years, the universe put me in a position where I had to focus on propagating forest gardeners, not a forest garden. So that's what I've been doing, and that's what I will continue to do, because the way we're going to learn how to do this fastest is to get thousands of people forest gardening and learning from each other. And, thousands of people in each region learning how to do it in their region with specific species and combinations of species. So yes, I do travel and teach. You can reach me through my website, edibleforestgardens.com. Has all my contact information. You can buy my books there. The best way for me to, 6 years out, I still haven't finished paying off all my debts from writing the thing. So if you buy it from me, I make more money. And, you buy it from Amazon, and my co-author and I split a very small number of dollars. It's a little ridiculous how that works. But so buying it directly from us helps a lot. And Eric Tonesmeyer, he has a website as well, which is a great website. It's called perennialsolutions.org, I believe. And he's also available for that stuff. And he's a brilliant guy. He's a total plant geek, and he's a lot of fun. So I will send you his direction as well as mine. But we're having a lot of fun being out there propagating these ideas and helping people to propagate forest gardens, and we're learning a lot in the process. So it's really good, and I hope people will join us. It's like I said, we've got lifetimes of quiet adventure, so it's a good thing, and it's going to take a couple hundred years to really see the potential come to fruition. So I'm 51. I don't think I'll last that long, but we'll see how long I can make it.
Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to your talk tonight.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks for having me on your show. And everyone out there, have a great day and a great life.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. For more information or to hear our other podcasts or interviews, visit www.sustainableworldradio.com. Sustainable World Radio is produced by Jill Cloutier. Music by Dana Lyons. Thanks for listening.